These are the types of things that can be very helpful to us when we're working internationally, but may not be obvious at all. So of course, when we are negotiating internationally, it's very confusing to figure out like what's just the individual you're working with and what has to do with the cultural background that they come from. But if we can figure that out, we can be more strategic and more empathic. So I have this system that I call culture mapping, which helps you to break culture down into 8 behavioral scales. So we look at things like how do you build trust differently in different cultures, and how do you make decisions differently in different parts of the world. And then you can kind of compare one culture to another and see both the similarities that you might leverage as advantages and where the gaps are that you need to be aware of. It helps you get a little bit more ready in advance to be more effective. Yeah, so of course, when we're negotiating, being able to pick up nonverbal cues is so critical, but it's confusing because nonverbal cues differ from one culture to another. And a very simple example that I had was doing some work in Tokyo where I asked the group if there were any questions. No one raised their hand. I went to sit down. My Japanese colleague came up to me and he said, Erin, there were some questions. Do you want me to try? And I said, sure. So he stood up. I said, Professor Meyer has just spoken with you. Do you have any questions? No one raised their hand, but he looked carefully around the room and then gestured to one person who had been sitting there, from my perspective, motionless, and said, do you have a question? And the guy said, oh, thank you, I do. He asks a fascinating question. So when I asked him, how did you know that those people had questions? He said, oh, well, it had to do with how bright their eyes were. And what I realized later as I was looking more for this was that what it had to do with was the person looking directly at him or at me and kind of grabbing his eyes. And once I was aware of that, I was able to start picking up a lot more dialogue in the room that otherwise had been invisible to me. These are the types of things that can be very helpful to us when we're working internationally, but may not be obvious at all if we're not thinking about it.